Hey everyone. So today we are going to talk about faith and a phenomena in epistemology that's known as self-fulfilling beliefs. So first of all, to start off, just sort of a brief definition of what faith is. Faith is a commitment regarding some proposition that involves a belief-like component and a desire-like component. So, we have faith regarding certain propositions all the time, faith that God exists, faith that your spouse was the right person to marry, faith that you can make it through grad school. And in these cases, these involve a belief-like component because faith isn't consistent with thinking that the proposition in question is impossible or even thinking that it's very, very, very unlikely. So you need to at least have some belief-like component, even if that's, a moderate level of confidence or thinking it's supported by some evidence or whatever. And then you also need to have a desire-like component. So you need to want the proposition in question to be true. This is kind of a common thing that a lot of people think is involved in faith. So it would be weird if you had faith that you would make it through grad school, but you really didn't want to go to grad school, or you had faith that your spouse was the right person to marry, but you really hoped you married the wrong person. Like those examples don't make sense. So faith also has this desire-like component. So this is one reason, because of this desire-like component, that faith isn't necessary for belief, because faith involves a desire-like component, but belief doesn't. There's lots of things we believe that we don't have faith in because we don't desire them to be true. Faith may also not be sufficient for belief. There's more of a debate about this, but some people think that if you have faith that something's true and then you get a bunch of evidence against that thing, you could continue to have faith even if you have so much doubt because of the counter evidence that you rule out belief. So here we're not really going to take a stand either way on whether faith entails belief or not. Okay, so that's a little bit about the definition of faith. Now let's move to this question: what kind of faith? And today we're going to be basically focusing on two strands. The first is what I call, intrapersonal faith, which would be faith in yourself, and then also interpersonal faith, which is faith in other people. So the talk title isn't actually totally accurate because I mostly focus on interpersonal faith, but I also think this can apply to faith in yourself as well. There just wasn't a snappy title that involved both. So we're also going to be focusing on faith that. So faith that a proposition is true, as opposed to like faith in a person or faith in an ideal or something. And then importantly, we're going to be focusing on faith as a mental state. It says something in your head, something that's like either belief-like or desire-like, as opposed to faith as an action. A lot of people talk about faith as an action, taking a leap of faith or acting by faith. We're not going to be talking about that. We're going to be talking about faith as a mental state. And the main thing we're actually going to be concerned with today is faith epistemic rationality. So how can faith be epistemically rational? That's sort of our main question. And this is opposed to faith's practical rationality. So epistemic rationality has to do with, being based on good evidence, being a candidate for knowledge, being reliably formed, whereas practical rationality has to do more with meeting your goals. So we're really honing in on questions about faith's epistemic rationality. And when it comes to epistemic rationality, I think there's at least two things that we want our theory of faith to do. The first is that we want our theory of faith to explain how faith can be rational, but still in some sense go beyond the evidence. A lot of people think that faith is a big part of what helps us keep our commitments in light of counter evidence. And so, we want to say, look, faith is important. Faith is an important part of a flourishing life. We have faith maybe in religious cases, of course, but also in non-religious cases, faith in our spouse, faith in our friends and family, faith in ourselves. And so we don't want to just say faith is always irrational, but again, we have this unique relationship to evidence. And just because faith goes beyond the evidence doesn't mean that, faith is always irrational and that's a good thing. We're not committing to fideism here. But we're just saying there's a sense in which faith goes beyond the evidence and faith helps us keep our commitments in light of counter evidence. So that's our first sort of desiderata when it comes to faith's epistemic rationality. The second is that we want to be able to explain the rationality of a leap of faith. So why is it rational, or at least sometimes rational, to take a leap of faith? This is often cashed out in terms of action, right? Like doing a trust fall or jumping across a wide crevice or whatever. But here, I think it's really interesting to think about how we might understand a leap of faith in terms of like a mental thing. So, like I said, there's faith as a mental state, faith as an action. Here we're focusing on the mental state thing. So could we take a leap of faith, but cash that out in terms of something that's going on in our heads? And I think we can. So what I want to argue is that there's an appealing way to meet both of these desiderata in the interpersonal and interpersonal case. And this appeals to what's called self-fulfilling or self-justifying beliefs. So I'm actually not going to be talking as much in this talk about faith in God specifically, but faith in God is something I will mention in the last section. So this is actually going to be more about either faith in yourself or faith in other people. Okay, so let's move to self-justifying beliefs. Self-justifying beliefs are beliefs that, when adopted, they actually create evidence for themselves. So I'm going to be using self-justifying and self-fulfilling beliefs interchangeably. But the idea is that they are justifying because of the way they are self-fulfilling, because they create their own evidence in this way. So self-justifying, self-fulfilling, it's going to mean the same thing for our purposes. And there is a literature on self-justifying beliefs. A lot of this actually goes back to William James, a really great philosopher, and everyone should read The Will to Believe. But basically there's 3 types of self-justifying beliefs. The first involves like a powerful being or machine. So here's some examples. And some of these are, more silly than others, but bear with me. So here's one by Kopik and Teitelbaum. God makes the following proposal. If you believe that it will rain in LA tomorrow, then God will make sure it rains in LA tomorrow. But if you believe it won't rain in LA tomorrow, then God will make sure that it doesn't rain in LA tomorrow. So whatever you believe, God is going to ensure that the truth follows your belief. So you have really good evidence that whether you believe it will rain or not, that's going to turn out to be true. Okay, second case is millionaire, which says an eccentric billionaire comes to your door with the following credible offer. So you have a really good reason to think they're telling the truth. She will give you $1 million if you believe that you will become a millionaire. Maybe she has some machine where she can measure, do some neuroscience stuff and figure out, yes, you do in fact have the belief. And if you form that belief, then she will give you $1 million. Third case is a mind reading machine. Alice's brain is attached to a mind-reading machine, which is in turn attached to a large visual display that is within Alice's view. When the machine is turned on, Alice will be asked to predict what number will appear on the display in 20 seconds, and that number is determined by what Alice believes the number will be. So if Alice says the number will be 5, it reads her brain and then puts a 5 on the display. Okay. We're mostly not going to be talking about these cases today, but I still think they're really interesting and kind of get us warmed up in the idea of what a self-justifying or self-fulfilling belief looks like. The second class of cases is cases of beliefs about yourself that are self-justifying or self-fulfilling. So the first is actually a case that is one William James does talk about, which is, you're lost in the wilderness, you're hiking around, you're trying to find the path back to civilization, and you come across this pretty deep, pretty wide crevice, and you imagine, there's a chance I could make this, but there's a chance I couldn't make this. Maybe you think your chances are like 50-50 or maybe like 60-40, slightly in favor of making the jump. But you realize if you believe you can't make the jump, you're just going to get so discouraged and basically just give up, and you'll honestly probably die out there in the wilderness. But if you believe you can make the jump, that's going to give you zeal and energy. It'll make you jump further. And so it'll make it much more likely that you'll make the jump. So it'll boost that probability, maybe from like 60 to 80 or 90, much higher, right? A second example involves having an illness. So believing that you'll survive a life-threatening illness makes it more likely you'll survive in a lot of cases. Believing you won't survive often makes you, pessimistic and makes it more likely you won't survive. So believing you'll survive makes it more likely you will. And then another example involves public speaking. So believing you'll give a great talk. Maybe you're in front of an audience, you have to give a talk. Believing you'll do a really good job makes it more likely you'll give a great talk, because you'll be able to shake some of those nerves off and it will give you confidence. So again, belief creates its own evidence. The final category is beliefs about other people. So for example, let's say your friend is playing a big basketball game coming up soon. Telling your friend you believe that they will win their basketball game gives them confidence and motivation to make them play harder, which makes it more likely they'll win. I think this example in general sort of points to the importance of fans in sports. One of the really interesting things with COVID is that a lot of the teams are playing without fans, and it really changed the dynamic of the game. And so I think having other people cheering for you, believing in you, saying you're going to do well, can actually make it more likely you'll win the game. Another example involving a surgery. So let's say your grandma has an upcoming serious surgery, and telling her you believe that she's strong and she'll do it, she's going to survive this surgery, come out the other end healthy and well. It can make it more likely she'll survive. It can change her outlook, make her more optimistic, etc. And finally is a marriage case. So making a marriage vow with your spouse, it demonstrates both faith in your spouse, but also faith in yourself. We'll talk more about that in a second. That basically gives both you and your spouse this motivation to remain faithful. You're saying, I trust you, I believe in you, I believe you'll remain faithful. And I think that can make them more motivated to stick with you, as opposed to if you said, I don't really trust you, or, I guess I'll make this vow, but I don't, or I don't even want to make the vow because I don't trust you. I mean, I think making the vow demonstrates a belief in your spouse, which makes them more likely to stick with you, at least in a lot of cases. Okay, so those are some examples of what self-justifying beliefs look like. And in general, they're beliefs that once the belief is formed, it creates evidence for itself. It's widely accepted that self-fulfilling beliefs like this are epistemically rational. So there's a whole host of people that argue that these beliefs can be rational when the initial probability of the belief in question before you adopt it, or so the initial probability of the proposition, I guess you don't have the belief yet, right, is middling, so like around 50%, or maybe it's like unspecified or unclear. So a lot of people argue that these beliefs are rational when the initial probability is around 50% or unclear. And some even argue that it could be rational to adopt a self-justifying belief when the initial probability is low, so a good bit less than 50%. We don't really need to take a stand on this here. I think the cases of where the probability is low are really interesting to think about. And obviously that would depend on how much forming the belief itself would give you additional evidence or would raise that probability. But here's sort of two stories about why this is rational. The first is an externalist story. And on the externalist story, the idea is that, look, beliefs are rational when they're produced by a reliable process. So a visual belief is rational when it's produced by a reliable process of vision. You can replicate this for lots of different belief forming processes we have. And the thought is that when a belief creates its own evidence, the belief is produced by a reliable process. So the thought is, in these cases of self-justifying beliefs, the ratio of true beliefs to false beliefs produced by this self-justifying mechanism, we're going to have a pretty favorable ratio there. So we'll have to, be careful there about what we say about the process type. But as long as the process type is something like beliefs that create their own evidence or beliefs that raise the probability of the target proposition sufficiently, then on an externalist story, the belief will be rational. On an internalist story, rational belief is determined by something like your evidence. And here's how the internalist story might go. If you believe this proposition, it becomes quite likely to be true. And as long as you have some level of awareness of that, or you know that something's quite likely to be true, then you have good evidence for it. And so then it's rational for you to believe it. You can think about this in another way too. So forming the belief, it raises the objective probability of the proposition in question. So again, assuming you have some level of awareness of what's going on, this is also going to raise the epistemic probability, which is the probability of the proposition on your evidence. So by forming the belief, you will thereby have good evidence that the proposition is true. So I think we can tell both an externalist story and an internalist story about why these beliefs are rational, but note that the internalist story will require sort of some degree of awareness that, this is a self-fulfilling belief. Okay, finally, a note about direction of fit. So a lot of people who think about beliefs and work on beliefs say that beliefs have a mind to world direction of fit. So you see that it's raining outside and then your mind conforms to the world. You form the belief it's raining outside because you've seen that be true in the world. And this is a weird case because the direction of fit of belief is actually flipped. So the rationality, like what makes the belief rational sort of follows the belief. In a lot of cases, you get this evidence, it's raining outside, and then your belief follows that. And in this case, it's reversed. There's this rationality making feature, but you have to form the belief itself, and then that belief creates the evidence, which makes it rational. So interestingly, this might be one of the only cases of beliefs that actually have a world to mind direction of fit rather than a mind to world direction of fit. One reason why I find these cases so fascinating. Okay. So let's move to the next section where I want to try to give some reasons to think that faith is self-justifying. And what this is going to do is we're really going to set that first category aside where there's some, God or a machine involved and really focus on cases of interpersonal faith and intrapersonal faith. So in cases of interpersonal faith, you might have faith that your friend will make her time goal in her upcoming marathon. And again, you communicate this to her. You say, you're an amazing runner. I have faith in you. You come to the race, you cheer her on. She knows you're on her side, right? She knows that you have faith that she's going to make her time goal. That gives her energy and zeal and enthusiasm, making it more likely that she will make her time goal. It might even make her train harder, honestly, but it's going to motivate her. Similar case with a job interview. You have a friend who has an upcoming job interview and you say, you're so good at interviews, you nailed this, you're going to nail this, I have faith in you, you got this. And so I think communicating that faith to your friend can again give them confidence and energy and make it more likely that they will nail their interview, especially if you're really genuine about it. So that's interpersonal faith. Intrapersonal faith would be faith in yourself. I actually think, as cheesy as it sounds, I think faith in yourself can actually be really, really important and powerful. One example of this is a TV show that's called Alone. So some people may have seen it, but basically it's a show where they take 10 people that are sort of wilderness survival experts, and they put them out there by themselves in the middle of the wilderness, and and they give them like 10 different things, like they can have like a fire starter or they could have like a sleeping bag. So they get to bring 10 items with them. Sometimes they bring like a bow and arrow. They can't bring like guns or anything like that. They get 10 different items they can bring with them, and whoever survives longest gets like $1 million or something. What's really cool about the show, and so they film themselves too, so they really are totally alone. There's no camera crew or anything like that. But the psychological element to the show is just as big as like learning about survival skills, or they'll be like, oh, you can eat this mushroom, but not this mushroom, or whatever. There's this huge psychological element, and they really struggle with like believing in themselves and wondering if they're cut out for this. And I think sometimes they just say, I'm not cut out for this. I want to go see my family. I'm done. But it's interesting to see the ones that do really well. They have so much faith in themselves, like so much self-confidence. And I think that's a case where really believing I can continue on this, I can keep going, and I can survive another day, even though I'm really hungry, that can make it more likely that you'll keep going, and that you'll do better in the show and maybe even win. But so that's a cool example. You should check out that show if you haven't watched it. But I think this also applies in general to a lot of our sort of personal ambitions or commitments. So you can think about goals we set for ourselves, especially like big goals. Like, I want to learn a new instrument. I want to learn how to play guitar. I really want to start working out more. I want to start this new workout routine. These sort of big goals that sometimes we structure our more smaller to-do list goals around. I think these function in a similar way. If you believe you can do it, and if you have faith in yourself, that makes it a lot more likely that you'll, wake up early and go work out, or really commit to practicing guitar every day. And also, the reverse is too true. If you say, I'm not cut out for this, I just can't do it, it makes it a lot more likely you won't do it. Some cases of faith, I think, can involve both interpersonal and intrapersonal faith. So these are especially cases of faith where sort of a group is working together for some goal or some outcome. I think marriage is a really good example of this, because when you make marriage vows, you have both faith in yourself and faith in your spouse. And then you communicate that. You say, I think we can do this. I think we're cut out and we can make it for the long haul. Finishing a dissertation maybe is not as good of an example of this, but often a successful dissertation involves both the person writing the dissertation, but also their advisors and their committee. And so I think if you, communicate, faith, either if you're the committee member, faith in your student, faith that like, you can do this, we can do this, I'm committed to giving you helpful feedback, or the student says, I think with your help, we can really make this a great dissertation. This could be another case where there's interpersonal and intrapersonal faith, and it's self-fulfilling in this way. And note that while we first talked about, the earlier cases we were talking about were cases of self-fulfilling belief, this story doesn't depend on faith always involving a belief. And that's because I think you can give this internalist or this externalist story about faith itself, whether or not that applies to belief. And I think it would just apply in similar cases of faith. So even if faith involves moderate confidence, or even if faith involves, being at least 50% likely, or thinking this proposition is the most likely of the live options, whatever that epistemic component is, even if it's not flat out belief, I think you can still tell the same story. So I don't think this story at all depends on whether faith entails belief. And I'm going to return to that in a second. Okay, here's a couple reasons to think that faith is self-justifying in this way. So the first two reasons are that it meets our first two desiderata that we were concerned with when we were thinking about faith's epistemic rationality. So the first is that it explains how faith can be rational, but have this unique relationship to evidence, right? Faith creates its own evidence. We were talking earlier about how in most cases, our beliefs follow the evidence. But in this case, we have this unique direction of fit where the evidence follows the belief. And, we still have that evidence. There's not I don't think there's a good reason to say these are just irrational cases. No, like it is a self-justifying belief. It's justified, right? But it still has this really different and unique relationship to evidence that's really different than a lot of normal cases of belief. The second desiderata is that it explains how a leap of faith can be rational, and also why we don't always have to just cash this out in terms of action. So again, the evidence follows the attitude. Once you take that leap and form the attitude, whether that's belief or faith or both, you get the evidence. And the leap is just forming the attitude. So I think this is interesting because we can take leaps of faith mentally and not just in how we act. Third is it explains why communicating faith to others in the case of interpersonal faith is so important. You might say, look, if you don't communicate to your friend that she's going to make her time on her upcoming marathon, or communicate to your friend he'll do well in his job interview, you don't really get the mechanism going. And yeah, that's true. That's why supporting each other and communicating with each other, that's part of what it is to be in a community and to have faith, and why relationship and community is so important to faith. So we do need that faith to be communicated on some level. Even if it's just showing up at your friend's marathon and cheering for her, you could communicate that, even if it's not like directly stating the proposition, like you will make your time. There's a lot of ways to communicate it, both in words and in actions. But I do think this communication of faith is really important. The next reason to think faith is self-justifying involves what's called epistemic partiality. Epistemic partiality is the idea that we can treat people who are close to us, we can believe different things about them than we can believe about neutral third parties, right? So, if you're watching two teams, consider like this case, you're watching two teams play a random basketball game at the gym, versus you're supporting your brother and his important basketball playoff game, right? So you might think, you can believe your brother will win on different evidence, or you can, have faith in your brother's team longer than you do with these just two random teams. Like if one team is up by 20 at halftime, you might not have faith that the losing team will win. But in your brother's case, if the other team is up by 20 at halftime, it seems a little bit more okay to have faith your brother will win. And there's a lot of these cases where it seems like we can believe differently about those close to us than we can about neutral third parties. This is controversial, of course, but I think there's this view of faith has interesting things to say about this. So it's like, look, what if you go to your brother's game and you talk to him before the game and you say, I have faith that you're gonna win this. You're so good at basketball. You cheer for him. You show up in body paint. You're his biggest fan, and you're really there supporting him and making him feel valued, and making him feel like you believe in him, right? It might be that without that, the initial probability that each team wins is similar. But you can treat your brother's case differently epistemically because you've supported him and communicated your faith. That makes it more likely he'll succeed. So you actually get more evidence he'll be successful. And because of that, it might take more counter evidence for you to give up your faith in your brother's team than to give up on the random team, that you believe will or will not win. It could also give us a reason to treat ourselves potentially differently than others. So when we talk about believing in yourself or whatever, if believing in yourself makes it more likely you'll succeed, then you could potentially be rational to believe in yourself longer or on less evidence than you believe about someone else, especially if they're not, someone close to you or your close friends or family. So you might hear a statistic like, 50% of people fail out of grad school. But if you believe that you'll successfully complete the degree, that can give you additional evidence that maybe a lot of those people didn't believe in themselves in that same way. So that makes you special, and that gives you extra evidence so you can keep believing in yourself even despite that statistic. Okay, 2 more, and then we'll just answer some questions about this. So the 5th reason that I think this is an interesting view of faith has to do with doxastic voluntarism, which is the view that we can control our beliefs. And in a lot of cases, it seems like we can't. We just see that it's raining outside and the belief follows automatically. But when the evidence follows the belief, and the evidence follows the belief either way, you believe you'll do well and you do well, or you believe you'll do poorly and that makes it more like you will do poorly, then it seems much more plausible that we have genuine choices about what to believe. And this can apply to faith as well. I think when faith is self-fulfilling, it's a lot clearer that we could have a genuine choice about where to place our faith. So this seems like a case where we have direct control over our attitudes. And of course, too, it's going to depend on what all is required for faith. So we talked about at the beginning that faith involves a commitment, faith involves a desire. So this will depend on questions about whether we can control that too. But if the commitment and the desire components are already in place, especially, then once you see this self-fulfilling mechanism, the epistemic component of faith is going to follow easily. Okay. The final reason in favor of this theory of faith is that faith doesn't have to violate evidentialism. Evidentialism is the idea that we should proportion our beliefs to the evidence. And in these cases, the attitude creates its own evidence, but the evidence is there, right? So you're not just believing the opposite of what the evidence supports or ignoring the evidence. In forming the belief, the evidence is following you. So we don't have to deny evidentialism in order to embrace this theory of faith. Okay, I'm going to close with 7 what I call frequently asked questions. You could definitely see some of these as objections to my view, but I'm kind of rebranding them as questions. But I think this will also, just help clarify some of the things that I'm saying and not saying. So I just decided to, just call them all questions. Okay. Question number 1, why think that this mechanism that we've been describing where faith creates its own evidence, why think that raises the probability of the target proposition enough? So if you believe you'll make the jump, that might make it a little bit more likely you'll make the jump. But why think that that is going to render faith rational? I basically have 2 responses to this. The first is that I'm not saying all faith is always rational. faith's rationality is going to depend on two factors. The first is the initial probability of the proposition before you form the attitude. And then the second is how much forming the attitude raises the probability, right? So if the proposition is super, super unlikely initially, then having faith would have to raise the probability quite a bit for this to be rational. However, if the initial probability of the proposition, if it's already like at 60%, then you don't need to raise the probability that much more to make faith rational. Okay, the second thing to note here is that if faith doesn't always involve belief, because maybe faith is consistent with less evidence or lower credences, then this self-fulfilling feature could actually apply to even more cases of faith than belief. It could make more cases of faith rational than cases of belief. So in other words, self-justifying faith doesn't need to raise the probability as drastically as is needed in the belief case. So we might have a reason to think that more cases of self-justifying faith are rational than cases of self-justifying belief. Question number 2, is probability raising enough for the belief to be rational? And there's some really interesting cases that people have given where something has a high probability, but it seems like you maybe shouldn't believe it. So if you have a lottery ticket, you might say, well, there's a ton of lottery tickets. It's very unlikely I'm a winner, so I'm going to believe my ticket will lose. And some people have argued you shouldn't believe your ticket will lose. Or if you're trying to figure out who committed some crime and you know that it was either this man or this woman, but you know that men are 10 times more likely to commit that crime than women are, there might be a high probability the man did it, but you shouldn't believe that the man did it, right? So it seems like there's cases that probability raising, maybe it raises your credence, but it shouldn't make you believe the thing in question. So the response here is like, yeah, sure. Maybe there are some cases where probability raising rationalizes belief, but it doesn't seem like these cases of self-fulfilling belief would fall into those categories. So there's been a number of different accounts, like maybe it's statistical evidence, maybe we shouldn't believe on the basis of statistical evidence. Maybe Martin Smith has this theory that's called the non-normic support theory, which says if the belief is false, would seek some explanation for why it's false. Those are the cases of justified beliefs. And so when we kind of look at the various theories for why, at least in some cases, we can't believe these highly probable propositions, these aren't the cases, these conditions won't be met in the cases of self-justifying belief. So even if probability raising isn't always sufficient for justified belief, when we look at those theories aren't ones that are going to be applying to the cases that we're interested in, these self-justifying or self-fulfilling beliefs. Okay, question number 3, we sort of touched on this already. Does one have to be aware of this mechanism in order for the faith to be rational? And basically what we already said is that this depends on if internalism or externalism is true. But if internalism is true, I mean, you don't have to understand all the philosophy and epistemology behind it, but you have to have some sense of forming the belief is going to give you confidence and energy that makes it more likely you'll meet your goal or more likely to be true or whatever, similar with the faith case. And if externalism is true, you might not even have to be aware of that, because we could still get that your belief is produced by a reliable process, even if you're not aware of that process. That's why it's called externalism. It's, external to what you're aware of. Okay, question number 4, how widely does this apply? Does this apply to all cases of interpersonal and interpersonal faith? Not necessarily. And I'm happy to supplement this account with other accounts of faith. I think there are some other really interesting accounts of faith, although not all of them focus on mental stuff or epistemic rationality. Some of them focus on action and practical rationality, but I'm happy to supplement this with other accounts. Nonetheless, I think this captures an important class of cases. Also note, I'm only suggesting a necessary condition for epistemically rational faith here. You'll have to add stuff like even some of that stuff we talked about at the beginning, probably, to get like full-fledged epistemically rational faith. Yeah, okay, question 5. Does this apply to theistic faith or faith in God? And here you might say, well, we want a unified account of faith, right? We don't want to say faith is rational in non-theistic cases here and in theistic cases here, and there's no connection between them, right? So I hear that, and I think that's important, but I will say I don't think this view as spelled out here exactly doesn't directly apply to faith in God, because having faith that God exists doesn't make it more likely that God exists. Your faith isn't gonna be able to control whether God exists or not, right? But I think at the same time, there's an important related mechanism that I want to explore in future work, which is this idea that maybe the evidence is already there, but having faith reveals evidence in a way that it isn't otherwise accessible. So you can't access the evidence until you take that leap of faith. So this is different than what I've been proposing earlier, because this is about revealing evidence rather than creating evidence. But it is something I want to explore more in future work. So I think a related thing can apply to theistic faith, even if it's slightly different. Okay, question 6. Aren't you just summarizing William James? And I do think this is very Jamesian. There's a spirit of this that is right up William James's alley. And I think, look, if I am summarizing James, that's cool, right? James is dope. More people should read him. But I also think there's value in sort of situating James's idea in a framework of some of this contemporary epistemology stuff. So, internalism and externalism, evidentialism, epistemic partiality, even permissivism, all this stuff is really relevant to this. And so I think there's a lot more connections to be made and work to be done about how it all fits together. I also don't think that William James talks much about the interpersonal case. I think his cases are more of like believing you'll make the jump, or believing you'll, give a good talk or whatever. So not as much having faith in someone else and then communicating that to them. So I think there are some differences, but I do think it's a very Jamesian idea. Okay, final question. What about the desire component of faith? So this is very exploratory, but I think there's some interesting stuff to be said here. So one thing that I'm not sure if anyone has talked about yet, but I think could be really interesting, is the idea of a self-fulfilling desire. So a case where desiring something makes that thing a good thing for you. And then that could make the desire rational if desires aim at the good in the same way beliefs aim at the truth. So I think this could apply to certain theistic commitments. So if you desire God to exist, that's part of having faith that God exists. But then the thought is like having faith in some sense changes the axiological status of God's existence for you. Maybe this enables you to access certain benefits that wouldn't otherwise be accessible to you without faith, such as having a relationship with God or going to heaven. And you could explore, the negative aspect of that too. Maybe if you don't have faith, God's existence would be a bad thing for you, or you shouldn't want God to exist. You would maybe be missing out on a potential great good, whether that's a relationship with God or, hell or annihilationism in the afterlife. And you'd also be missing out on one of the world's most important truths. And so maybe having faith that God exists makes it good for you that God exists, and not having faith that God exists makes it, neutral or bad for you that God exists. So again, this is super exploratory, not something I've been spent a bunch of time thinking about, but I think this project could be really interestingly connected to this project above, especially if I sort of went and tried to, make sense of all of this in the theistic case. So I'm happy to, I want to think more about this, and if people have suggestions on what this self-fulfilling desire thing might look like, I think that would be a really interesting thing to explore further.